It's no secret that Hideaki Sorachi took a big inspiration from historical events when coming up with Gintama. From a quick glance through Wikipedia, the series seemed to be greatly inspired by the Bakumatsu period, which is essentially synonymous to the late Edo period. And you can see how most of Gintama's cast were influenced from real-life figures. Like how the loud fellow is based on the samurai-turned-entrepreneur Sakamoto Ryoma. How the Shinsengumi is based on an actual special police force of the same name. Or how our beloved neighborhood terrorist is based on the Japanese statesman Kido Takayoshi, whose alias was Katsura Kogoro at some point. But what exactly is the Bakumatsu period in the first place, and what kind of context does it provide? To properly illustrate this, it's important for me to first establish the landscape of Japan leading up to the late Edo period. At the start of the 17th century, there was a great conflict between the eastern and the western region of Japan. Ultimately, Tokugawa Ieyasu led the eastern region to victory and established the shogunate government in Edo, which is present-day Tokyo. This effectively reduced the emperor to a mere figurehead who possessed little to no political power. Another important component to this part of history is that the nation followed a strict caste system. At the bottom, we have the commoners, consisting of merchants, artisans, and peasants. Above that, we have the samurais, followed by the daimyos, who are basically landowners that may or may not be samurais as well. A step higher than that, there's the shogun. And finally, at the peak, we have the emperor. But psych, not really, since the shogun is now the one that actually governed everything. Several decades after Tokugawa Ieyasu laid the groundworks for his ideal society, his grandson Iemitsu, who was now the shogun, introduced the Sakoku Edict. The decree had three main key points. Firstly, Japanese people were not allowed to leave the country, and anyone who was caught in the act were to face capital punishment. Secondly, Christianity was straight up outlawed. The logic goes that adopting Christian beliefs would imply disloyalty to their gods, which isn't really a big deal. But this would lead to the slippery slope of being disloyal to their shogun, which is absolute heresy. Lastly, trades with outsiders were strictly limited, which virtually cut off relationships with the Westerners, except for the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, or the VOC for short, who just really didn't care about spreading the teachings of Christ and just wanted to talk business. As a result, they were granted a small enclave somewhere in Nagasaki to conduct their dealings. Judging from these three key points, it's no wonder that the Land of the Rising Sun is generally regarded to be an isolated nation during this period of time. But contrary to this belief, Japan still made somewhat frequent contacts with outside nations such as China and Korea, as well as the aforementioned VOC. From then on, the Tokugawa clan brought upon a surprising period of stability, and their reign can be described as highly authoritative, yet seemingly paradoxically, decentralized at the same time. Now, how can a government maintain its legitimacy while still granting the people the freedom to go off and do their own thing? By holding their family hostage, of course. Now, to clarify, the daimyos who served the shogun were free to do as they pleased within their assigned domains, as long as they collected the necessary taxes and not scheme an uprising. To ensure this, the daimyos were forced to hold dual residency, both in Edo as well as their designated domains. They typically spent alternating years between the two places, while their families were forced to stay behind in Edo at all times, essentially as a form of insurance for the bakufu. In addition, to further cement the Tokugawa's reign, the shogun also granted himself the authority to redistribute land based on which daimyos he liked best. The daimyos who were deemed most trustworthy, can lick the most boots, were granted a bigger chunk of land, while the ones that were deemed shady were given less land and strategically placed away from the capital. While these measures can be considered megalomaniac, pragmatically, it led Japan to be a stable nation. And a stable nation meant growing business. And growing business meant increasing prosperity. And increasing prosperity meant more people. And more people meant growing business. And the cycle continues. On the surface, everything seemed fine and self-perpetuating. But if we take a closer look at it, there were some concerning cracks that formed along the way. For one, the shogun's authority to essentially cast out any potentially shady daimyos naturally sparked some friction. It's also important to note that most of these shady daimyos were descendants of the clan who fought Tokugawa Ieyasu during the Battle of Sekigahara, which further contextualizes the bad blood amongst them. While there were attempts to reconcile their relationship, such as by arranging interdomain marriages between the two parties, the discrimination just never was properly dealt with at this stage. This gave birth to groups of angry elite. Secondly, rapid economic expansion indirectly implies the accumulation of debt. While debt in itself isn't inherently a bad thing, when you couple it with external factors, such as frequent fires around the city, great earthquakes that literally shook the nation, as well as the sudden drastic cooling of the climate, which led to horrible crop conditions and thus caused region-wide famine, the already struggling economy just simply would not be able to stay afloat at this rate. This gave birth to groups of angry commoners. Finally, as Matsudaira elegantly puts it, the samurais who were originally hired to protect their lords during times of constant wars were now effectively rendered paperweight once their potential employers stopped needing any protection. Left without a sense of purpose, the samurais were faced with an identity crisis. Additionally, the public perception now viewed the samurais as a threat to the current peace. As a result, their social status, which was once regarded to be quite honorable, progressively got worse and worse as time went on, because they all were now basically just madaos at this point. This gave birth to groups of angry samurais. So, to summarize, Japan was full of angry people, but this was admittedly still a manageable problem for the Bakufu. With a little bit of reform here and there, it could have all been somewhat dealt with. That is, until the US came on knocking and relayed the simple message: agree to trade in peace or suffer the consequences in war. This dramatically escalated the tension of the Japanese people past its threshold, and the need for reform became the need for revolution. And thus marks what is generally considered to be the start of the Bakumatsu period. Now, most of you probably already know that in our universe, the Bakufu opted to be trampled over by the Western forces, just like how the ones in Gintama's world chose to surrender to the Amanto aliens. It's tempting to criticize the Bakufu's questionable decision-making process during this tender time period, but I definitely am not envious of the position they were in. The shogunate was essentially forced to a double whammy of impasses. Firstly, they were compelled to appease the frustration of their own people. But with the situation at hand, the government was forced to choose between waging a war that they most definitely would lose, considering the difference between their military strength, or face further backlash from their own people. Secondly, the Bakufu had every reason to question the Americans' motive, especially after learning how China got royally screwed over by the British following the Opium War. On the other hand, the Bakufu realized that in order to continue upholding the Sakoku edict, they needed to have the means to protect themselves from foreign power. This paradoxically implied the need for importing Western technologies to keep out the Western forces. Trapped between a rock and a hard place, the Bakufu essentially just Hail Married the decision-making process and relied on the Magic 8 Ball. Consequently, the shogunate ended up agreeing upon the Treaty of Kanagawa, which was actually quite tame. Although, throughout the next several years, other Western countries started chiming in, and the demands would eventually snowball into something that's not too different from the unequal treaties the Chinese were forced to sign for the British, with the only exception being the non-involvement of opiums. The important thing to highlight here is that the jump between opening the nation's border to being essentially overrun by Western powers didn't occur overnight. Initially, a lot of discontent people understandably started expressing their dissatisfaction by rioting across the streets of Japan. But most of the people's anger was still directionless, and regrettably, blinded by their own frustration, most of them ended up directing their hatred towards other citizens, who were in fact also suffering alongside them. The decentralized structure of Japan at the time also didn't help make things better. To try and counteract this, a group of political activists attempted to spread the Sonojoi Manifesto. This way, the people could be united under the same banner, while still being able to act independently and carry out their individual ideals. The term Sonojoi itself literally translates to revere the emperor, expel the barbarian, which embodies the pro-imperialist and anti-foreigner rhetoric the group promoted. These groups of political activists essentially formed a loose confederacy that were collectively known as the Shishi, which also insinuates that the Joi Shishi in Gintama is a portmanteau of Sonojoi and Shishi. So far, the parallels between historical events and Gintama's setting are undeniable. But what about the plot? To end off, I would just like to put a disclaimer that I am neither Japanese, American, nor any other nationalities that were mentioned in this video. So I most definitely have a lack of perspective in this matter. For the sake of transparency, my biggest source of information for this video is the book A Modern History of Japan, From Tokugawa Times to the Present by Andrew Gordon. Decent book, check it out if you're interested, although I do have some problems with it. Anyway. And folks, thank you all for watching, and see you next time.